As you're able, let's stand together and hear what Paul has to say to the church in Corinth. If I speak with the tongues of mortals and angels, but do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge and have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But for prophecies, they will come to an end. And as for tongues, they will cease. And as for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part. We prophesy only in part. And when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put away childish ways. For now, we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know only in part. I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. This is the word of the Lord. Amen. You may be seated.
Thank you, Marianne. Wasn't that wonderful? Marianne, if I give you a recorder, will you just do some bedtime stories for me? I've got a few that I would like for you to read for me. That was wonderful. Made me feel so at peace. You know, we traveled some this summer, not a lot. I wish I could say a lot, but we did take a group from here to the Passion Play in Germany and Prague and Budapest and all these different countries to watch the Passion Play that comes every 10 years, although this time it was 12 years. And I thought, man, it's going to be great to get into Eastern Europe and get out of the heat from Houston. And it was 98 degrees in Europe when we went, so I just can't get away from it. So when we got home, we said, well, we'll just stay here, and I guess that's why it's been so hot. So, you know, I was thinking recently, those of you who know kind of me or even this much involved in kind of what's going on in the church, you know that church has been tough lately. It doesn't matter what denomination you're in, if it's Presbyterian or Episcopalian, but Methodists have been going through their own little squabble. And sometimes when I go to these Methodist meetings or whatever, I start to feel a little sorry for myself. And I think, man, as a pastor, I've just got a lot of stuff going on. And then God sort of does this to you. It's time to preach again, and you're going to preach 1 Corinthians 13. And part of it means you have to understand the context of 1 Corinthians, the whole letter that Paul writes to Corinth. And I start looking at poor old Pastor Paul and all the stuff that he was dealing with in just one church. And he had lots of churches all over the place. And I thought to myself, you know what, John? You got it pretty good. I mean, if you think about when Paul gets to Corinth, now remember, he's got churches in Galatia and Ephesus and Thessaloniki and all over in Antioch. But he gets to Corinth, and it's like, you ever seen that ice trucker show where the trucks are trying to make it and they hit the wrong ice patch and they set off? That's exactly like Paul in Corinth, man. He's just off in the ditch because of this church. This church in Corinth was a mess. And I mean, it was such a mess that in some ways it's helpful for us to sort of read and understand what's happening there, because it reminds us that even as much of a mess as Christians put themselves into, there are some ways that Paul gives us, some tools of Christian teaching that help us to figure out how to navigate through divisions and disagreements and disunity, not just in church, but as Christians in anything in our lives. You can count 13 distinguishable disagreements that church is dealing with in Corinth that Paul addresses in his letter to the church. There are actually 2 more that haven't arisen yet, but will come, and he mentions them. But there are 13 distinguishable problems that are here. And I want to list them all to you a little bit real quickly, and then I want to sort of give you a high-level look at this stuff. He had these people, the church had divided up into factions, into partisan different groups. In modern church, you'd call them Sunday school classes. With different opinions about everything, right? And so, one like, well, we're followers of Apollos. Remember Apollos came, he was really good. Oh, yeah, well, we're followers of Paul. I mean, Paul's the big guy. And some of them were so holy, there's like, oh, yeah, well, we're followers of Jesus. That's always the trump card my wife reminds me. Every week she says, what are you preaching about this week? And after almost 30 years in ministry and 29 years of marriage, my answer to her is, when she says, what are you preaching about Sunday? I say, Jesus. She goes, good. She likes that answer. And so anytime you get in an argument, I've found out in the church world, the quicker you can say, I'm on Jesus's team, the higher the ground you have, right, in the argument. That's exactly what happens here. They had some sexual immorality going on. I want to try to stay as like G-rated or PG-rated as I can, but there was some cultural practices of incest within families and things. And Paul says, yeah, we're going to have to kind of tidy this up. We're not going to keep that going on. There was prostitution in their culture in the day. Now remember, we're talking about 2,000 years ago in Greco-Roman sort of culture. There were these temples and there were temple prostitutes. And, some people would go and worship and other people just went because it was there. And Paul's like, yeah, we're going to have to tidy this up a little bit. This is not the way it's going to work in our society. You're not going to bring all these pagan practices in. There was questions about celibacy even within your marriage. There were questions about Christians who were married to other Christians that said, hey, Paul, can I get a divorce? And then there were Christians married to people who weren't Christians. Pagans said, hey, Paul, what about me? Can I get a divorce? And on. There were lawsuits. Can you imagine Christian people suing each other? Lawsuits within the church. There was some 2 Corinthians, Paul will come back and it indicates there's some thievery going on. That's also a shock to me. There's contact with idolatry. The Gentiles didn't have a problem eating the meat that was sacrificed to the idols, but the Jews, it was unclean. Well, you got a church with Jews and Gentiles. You got all different races, mixtures, and cultures. And Paul has to deal with this because it's fixing to come to blows. There was some stuff going on in the worship services that some people didn't like. Again, 2,000 years ago, worship practices were really different, and they brought a lot of their temple worship styles into the church, and one of them was they weren't really happy the way the women were dancing around, and sometimes, the clothes would slide off the shoulder, and there was a problem with all of this stuff. I'm keeping it G-rated, and you have this, but then there's worship that's chaotic. They're speaking in tongues. They're speaking in languages. They're getting ecstatic, and Paul's got to police all of that. And then there's this communal meal that he's called them to meet together and have this communal meal, but you have socioeconomic disparity. And so you've got people that are really wealthy because it's bring your own. It's BYOP, bring your own picnic. And you bring your own food, and if you're wealthy, you bring, your pate and your caviar and your steak and your nice Cabernet. And if you're not very wealthy, you bring like a loaf of bread for you and your 10 members of your family or whoever it is. But it'd be like Second Sunday chicken. You bring your own picnic. And the people who have the means would have a nice spread of food. Maybe there was a family that didn't have means and they have almost nothing at the table, and you're sitting next to each other. And this one table is celebrating and getting drunk, and the other table is over there trying to share enough bread for their family. And Paul's like, we gotta get this figured out. People are going hungry while others are feasting and getting drunk. And then there are people who are denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and they're denying the fact that Christians, when they die, will be raised from the dead. All right, so what I'm saying to you is now that I've listed this, I think and go, being a Methodist pastor right now is easy compared to all of this. I can't imagine how Paul deals with all this stuff, and yet he does. And if you were going to simplify this down and look at it from 30,000 feet, you see, what are the real issues here? When it's all said and done, there were four main difficulties. One, there was a basic failure in relating as Christians ought to relate to one another. There's no kindness, there's no gentleness, there's no patience, there's no love for one another. There's a dramatic failure of the leadership of the church to act as Christian leaders ought to do. The same characteristics. The leaders ought to do even better on these characteristics than the members of the church. There's this arrogant theological reasoning on the part of some that's almost amateurish and overconfident. This is, I liken this as like, Paul spent his whole life studying from the Pharisees, from the school of the Pharisees, and now he's spent 3 years out in the desert to learn from the Holy Spirit of the Scriptures, and he comes in and someone who just woke up yesterday and decided, well, I'm an expert in this Christian thing. It's kind of like, you get a little ache somewhere and you look up on Google, and it tells you what you got, and you call your doctor and you say, hey, I got something really bad. And your doctor's like, yeah, medical school is nothing. I mean, Google's it now. That's why. And sometimes as preachers, we spend our whole lives studying the Bible, our whole lives studying the history of theology and different interpretations, and someone will come up and say, you got this all wrong on this. Sometimes you do, but most of the time, they're wrong. And then you have tensions arising from these pressures around Paul's teachings around sexual relations that's putting a lot of pressure because they're living in a culture where a lot of things are allowed, and Paul's trying to rein and police that in for the protection of the community and for the protection of the family. So I say all that because 1 Corinthians 13 is read in every wedding that you almost will ever attend, right? And so we think, hey, Paul wrote this for weddings. Paul didn't write 1 Corinthians 13 for a wedding, and you can't take 1 Corinthians 13 out without putting it in the context of all that he's battling and dealing with as a pastor in a deeply divided and disunified church. 1 Corinthians 13 is intended for a divided church dealing with serious conflict. And the passage speaks to the kind of love that allows the church to be united in purpose, even when its many members are different and divided. What holds the community together, Paul teaches, is not agreement. It's not that you all see everything the same way. Not that because in these 13 agreements, what Paul never does in his epistle is unpack each one and go, okay, you're right and you're wrong, and here's the explanation. Okay, you're right and you're wrong, here's it. He doesn't do that. He teaches this unity in its midst of love. It's not about agreement. It's not about legislating that everyone adopt their own personal beliefs, even in the sense of eating the meat sacrificed to idols. He doesn't say, you're right and you're wrong. What he does is he says to those, he's like, look, you who feel like you can eat the meat and you're fine with it, you're stronger than the other people, actually. But in love, can you just not eat the meat for them out of love? You see, this is how he solves the disagreement. And sometimes we think it comes down to like, well, Paul, who's right and who's wrong? And how do we get the agreement? How do we get the like-minded, the hive effect where everyone is adopted to the same personal beliefs? It's not about debating. It's not about arguing for my own personal perspective. The community, he says, is not held together by those things, not by agreement, but by love. 1 Corinthians 13 is the centerpiece. It's his masterpiece. And it's quite poetic that he puts right here in the center of this letter written to a church deeply divided. And he does this in his other epistles too. Every epistle, there are some issues he's dealing with in every one of his churches. And he works toward the same thing. How do we get unity together in the midst of this division? And so this Corinthian church is torn up by all these disagreements. The contemporary congregation is having difficulty in worship. They're having difficulty in different opinions and views on issues, but they're all together one family. And Paul has to make this stand out. And so in this moment, he puts it all on the apex, the fulcrum of love. It's love. It's love. Paul does not merely intend for 1 Corinthians 13 to be read at weddings. It's great for weddings, by the way. It was read at my daughter's wedding. It's great for weddings, but what happens is we hear it at weddings all the time, and we think it's this cutesy little poetic, wonderful thing about the aspirations of love, and we forget the context. It is a pastor writing to his church that is deeply divided, and he says, this is the answer. This is the answer. That's 1 Corinthians 13. I've seen these disagreements. You know, you would think that we would learn through 2,000 years of continuing to divide, continuing to argue, continuing to disagree. And whatever the latest cultural disagreement is, just look back in 2,000 years of what, every 30 to 50 to 100 years, there's another cultural disagreement that splits the church again and splits the church again and splits the church again and splits the church again. And it usually is around our own personal things, our own personal desires to be right about things. And sometimes there are ways in which the church is being refined in a good way. But I still think that God's design and desire is not for it to keep splitting into smaller and smaller and smaller factions. So Paul pulls out this really big artillery piece, I think, for him to help keep unity, community, and love. He says, the greatest of these is love. I hear there are divisions among you, and I believe it. He knows it. But actually what Paul says, and I agree, is that divisions are not a horrible thing. Because when you have a disagreement or a division, what it does is it reveals the sincerity of someone's spirit and heart. A disagreement or a division now really shows what's really inside of someone. And so I love how churches talk about, Jesus is our centerpiece. We operate by Jesus. Jesus is who we follow, and we're called to love, and then there's a disagreement, and all of a sudden, people are acting like it's the, Maury Povich show or something. And you don't see a lot of love, and you realize, are those just words, or is it really there? And that's what Paul is saying. It can't be just words. And so in 1 Corinthians, Paul is encouraging a revolutionary quality of love that is set free from self-interest, set free from self-centeredness, a love that is more nearly like the love of God. Love has nothing to do with self-centeredness, self-interest, self-seeking, or selfishness, period. The love of God, the love that Paul is lifting up, the love of Jesus is not about self-interest, self-centeredness, self-seeking, or any kind of selfishness. He doesn't use the word humility, but he could. He could talk about the humility of love. But according to Paul, love is virtually impossible when a person's first or sole concern is the self. Love has to always be centered around God, and love's field of concern cannot be about itself. It's got to be about others. I want to share with you these 3 examples from Thomas Merton of 3 different types of love and show you sort of the essence of what Paul is trying to say here. Thomas Merton, who is a great Catholic theologian and a monastic leader, wrote some wonderful contemplative and prayerful items. But in his reflections, he talks about these characteristics of love. And he says there's 3 types of love. He says the first one is infantile love. Don't you love that? Isn't that a beautiful picture of a little baby? Infantile love. In infantile love, he says, I love you simply because you love me. You haven't really differentiated the self yet. So you're just there. You look into the face of the mother. You look into the face of the father. You look into the face of whatever, and that face is friendly. I love you because you love me. Period. That's it. And then we grow and we begin to differentiate a little bit. We begin to see that, hey, I'm an individual person here. And I have a will, and I have a desire, and I have wants. We call them the terrible 2s or the terrible 20s or whatever. You fill in the blank. And I have this way, and he says we progress from infantile love, I love you because you love me, to an immature love, which is I love you for what you do for me. I love you for what that love, how it makes me feel. I love you for what it does for me in my life. And so when we don't get what we want, not really sure how well that love works. Now, I took this picture of a child in a tantrum. This is not a child that attends Chapelwood. They attend a church nearby. No, I'm kidding. I'm just... But this is what happens. I don't get what I want, and so we have this massive breakdown. Love doesn't work the same way. If I don't get what I want from you, then love's qualified. Love is conditional. That's immature love. What Thomas Merton says is that unfortunately, while a lot of us will move from infantile love to immature love, some of us are never fully capable or never allow ourselves to move from immature love ever for the rest of our lives. And so it's not about how old you are, it's about how you love. Some people are never able to move beyond, I love you for what it does for me. I love you for how it makes me feel. I love you for what I get out of it. But Merton says that the love we are to aspire to, the love that we are to try to embody, is to move towards the love of God, the pure love, the perfect love, the mature love. And while maybe we're never able to live it out in every facet of our lives, we begin to see it work through in so many different ways in relationships. And perfect love or mature love is defined as not I love you because you love me, and not I love you for what it does for me. Mature love is I love you for what it does for you. Listen now. Not I love you for what it does for me or how it makes me feel. I love you for what it does for you and how it makes you to become the person God created you to be. That's the kind of love Paul is talking about. Paul lists it here. You know, it's interesting if you really unpack this, and we did a line by line, it really talks about if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, have not love, I'm a noisy gong. If I have all prophetic powers, if I understand all mysteries and I have all knowledge, what he's saying is, if I'm really right, I really know better than everyone else. He goes, you can be right. You can know better. You can have all the knowledge and all the prophecy and all the power. But if you don't have love and you're just about you and winning and yourself and what it does for you, then you're just a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. You're just noise in the night. That's not love. And what we find is the essence of love is mercy and forgiveness. The heart of love is mercy and forgiveness. That's what it means to love. And it's only possible because love respects and honors other people. If love is truly selfless and not self-centered and not self-interested and not self-seeking, then it loves and respects and honors other people. And when you love and respect and honor other people, mercy and forgiveness they flow out of the heart. These are the two qualities that amplify the virtue of love. They give specificity to it. You can go to the next slide. Mercy and forgiveness speak to that relational nature of love, for we do not love in theory. Listen now. We do not love as a concept. Love has to do with the messy work of relationships. It has to do with the messy work of division. It has to do with the messy work of grievance and interpersonal strife. Patience and kindness are forms of mercy practiced in our relationships with others. Love is a verb. You've heard this. It's not a noun. He doesn't operate when everything goes the way you want. Love really is at work when things go the way you don't. Mercy and forgiveness. This is why Paul says very explicitly in verse 5, look at what he says. Love keeps no records of wrongs. No one in here has a record of wrongdoing by other people in their lives, do you? And that's what he says. Love is patient and kind. It doesn't envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That can only happen, though, when we practice this mature love that Paul is talking about that respects and honors other people. Not a theory, not a concept, put into practice. And so it's not so much saying, you need to be more patient, you need to be more kind, or you need to stop envying other people so much, or you need to stop boasting quite so much, or you need to stop being quite so prideful. Those things are helpful and needful, and I would encourage all of you to stop doing those things, right? But what happens is when you treat it that way, love turns into a self-improvement program, and again, it becomes about you. Paul says, verse 4 through 8 that I just read to you, he says, this is what love will look like when it takes over your life. This is what your life will look like when it takes over. You will become patient. If love really is the motivation of your life, this mature love, you will be more patient. You will be more kind. You will stop boasting. You will let go of envy. You will no longer be prideful. You will accept others as they are. You will rejoice in what is true and what is real, both in yourself and others. And that's all Paul's saying. He wants us to give ourselves wholeheartedly to God, to the love, because love is at the heart of God. That's who God is, John says. God is love. And so we rejoice in what is true and what is real, both in yourself and in others. I think the question for us today and every day is, how do we love? How do we love? And when you think of yourself in that spectrum, I can tell you that there are some times when I love in immature ways. And sometimes I do okay and I love in more mature ways. And sometimes I go back and forth. In some areas of my life, it's all mature love. In some areas of my life, it's a lot of immature love. But the point is that Paul says that we've got to stop thinking about solving the disagreements and the disunity in any other way other than love. So the next time you're at a wedding and you hear this passage read, I hope that it will take on a whole new meaning for you. It's very appropriate to read at weddings. But man, it's more appropriate to live ingrained in our life each and every day, not just within divisions that are within the church, because that's Paul's context. He's dealing with divisions within the church, but this is appropriate for divisions anywhere in our lives. That love is our primary motivation, and that we can learn to love others not for what it does for me, but that true, mature love is to learn to love others for what it does for them. Let's pray. Lord, 1 Corinthians 13 is a powerful and poetic testimony, teaching for us all. And when we put it in the context of all the things going on in 1 Corinthians, Lord, it really gives us some new insight and understanding. I pray that love will saturate our lives. Not love that is rooted in selfish ambition or selfish deceit or anything else, but a mature love that flows in and through us, that we can begin to be Jesus for the world, to begin to be Jesus in the midst of our disagreements. We're going to always have disagreements. That's okay. We're always going to have different ways that we see the world or how things are happening, but how we engage together. Lord, you keep pointing that out. That's where it all lands. I pray that we'll remember that. That we'll remember that we are one body in you, even in our disagreements. Disagreements will be here for all of eternity until we're resting beside Jesus. But I pray that as long as we are here together, Lord, that we'll love each other and that we will embody Christ to a world that is in need. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.